SN Pittsburgh special presentation.
Hi, I'm John Delano, political editor, KDK TV, CBS Pittsburgh. And our very special guest is congressional candidate, Republican Sean Parnell. Sean, good to see you. Thank you, sir, for being with me.
Hey, John, good to see you too.
So this weekend, the state Supreme Court issued its ruling in your case. Before I get into some of the details of that, your reaction to their decision?
Yeah, well, obviously I was disappointed because they didn't rule on the merits of the case, and I think it's important. You know, the two conservative justices on the PA Supreme Court both concurred and dissented, and quite frankly, I thought that their dissents were pretty thoughtful, and because really. But ultimately, I'm disappointed in their ruling because they didn't evaluate the constitutionality or the merits of the case at all, and primarily the reason they just cited that I waited too long to file it. But that puts me in a tough spot, John, because it puts me in a catch-22. Had I filed it earlier, I would have probably not been able to bring the case into court because I wouldn't have had legal standing. I wouldn't have had legal standing to bring it. And so they would have probably said, well, the harm that you're alleging is speculative, right? And so bring it back later. And so the ruling cited that I brought the case too late. And so that puts me in a really tough spot. But because they dismissed it with prejudice, and this is what bothers me the most, is they said that, like me and only me, I can't raise a question of Act 77's constitutionality at all, ever in moving forward in the future at all in the state of Pennsylvania, which I think is wrong. I just don't think that that's right. And, you know, John, the core of this case has never been about fraud. It's never been about, you know, wanting to throw out 2.5 million absentee ballots. It's not about that. What we asked the court to do was to stop certification while we evaluated the constitutionality of Act 77 to try to figure out what we can do with those mail-in ballots to make sure that everybody's vote is protected, John.
Let me ask you about that, Sean, because I think that's the one thing that a lot of people have picked up on. Many of us, including yours truly, voted by mail.
Yeah.
My vote counts just as much as someone who voted in person. You don't want to throw out my mail-in votes? Explain yourself.
Yeah, so let me first explain the process, right? The reason why I believe that Act 77 is unconstitutional is because it requires a constitutional amendment. Act 77 would be the most sweeping electoral change in our Commonwealth's history in over 200 years. So in order for a constitutional amendment to happen, it needs to be voted on in back-to-back legislative sessions, advertised in two separate newspapers for like 3 months, and then it needs to be put on the ballot in a referendum. And why? Because the framers of our Pennsylvania Constitution believed that the people of our great Commonwealth should have a say in the political destiny of this state, and the people of our Commonwealth should have a say in how elections are conducted. Now that was not done, right? And so to me, I personally believe that Act 77 is unconstitutional on the merits. And so here's what I would say is that if it's found that Act 77 is in fact unconstitutional, then the 2020 election was also unconstitutional. Now, let me ask you, let me put forward like maybe an analogy, John. Like, let's say, for example, I came to you and I said, you know, I'm going to pay you $10 for your ballot, John. And you know what? I'm going to deliver that ballot for you. And then a diligent election worker says, wait a second, this ballot was harvested. This shouldn't count, and then discards the ballot. Is the election worker the person who disenfranchised that voter, or was it the person who paid that person to harvest their ballot? I contend it's the person who paid for that. Now, my point is that as I'm a simple plaintiff in this lawsuit that's trying to bring a remedy to this situation, a constitutional remedy to this situation, what my lawsuit contends is that the government of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, from the governor to the attorney general, who, by the way, didn't opine on the constitutionality of Act 77 when it was passed, and the state legislature, the General Assembly, disenfranchised all Pennsylvania voters because Act 77 was inherently unconstitutional. And what I'm saying is, I'm asking the court simply to help us find a remedy. I'm not asking the court to necessarily throw away 2.5 million absentee ballots. No, I'm simply saying that unconstitutional election laws disenfranchise everybody. And
so you want to redo the election.
Well, I don't know, John. I mean, truthfully, what I'm asking for, and it says it right in the lawsuit, is I'm deferring to the court's expertise to help. They could fashion a number of different remedies. They could do what's called, and by the way, look, I'm not an attorney, but retrospective relief, and say, hey, just what you said, let's have a do-over, right? A special election in Pennsylvania. Or they could say, hey, look, 2020 is done and over with, but Sean, you've got a point. Let's make sure that we do the right thing moving forward, right?
That, of course, was the opinion of the two Republican justices in their concurrence and dissent. They basically said they would send it back to the Commonwealth Court and let the Commonwealth Court do the analysis that you just did.
And so a couple things, John. Like, I think that, you know, the General Assembly thought that they were putting forward a law in good faith to make it easier for people to vote, and that's a good thing. But the fact is that Act 77, the constitutional amendment for Act 77, was never done. And so this case is not about mail-in ballots good, mail-in ballots bad, right? This is a question of constitutional procedure. If you want to pass Act 77, my point is, do it the right way. And the most important part of the constitutional amendment process is that the people should have a say in how we conduct our elections here in the state of Pennsylvania.
Sean, let me ask you this question, because some of your critics say, well, Sean Parnell, he encouraged people to use mail-in voting during the election. I think you tweeted on that. And now, after the result comes out and you've lost to Connor Lamb narrowly, you now want to throw it all out.
So a couple points on that. One, I didn't know that the law was unconstitutional back then, right? And so my point is that Democrat or Republican, if a citizen learns that a law is unconstitutional, it's our duty and responsibility as citizens to challenge that law, number one. And number two, even if I had known that Act 77 was unconstitutional, I had no legal standing to even bring the case until after the election and I had suffered some harm, right? These are all legal terms, but my point is, if we don't challenge this law now, I think that we will forever lose the opportunity and the standing to challenge the law in the future, because the law would just become the status quo. And so I'm not doing this. And by the way, I'm not only am I suing the governor and the secretary of state, I'm also suing the General Assembly, which is controlled by my own party. Because look, I am not out here. I don't take an oath to defend a political party, right? I take an oath to protect and defend the Constitution and the people that Constitution protects, right? And the PA state Constitution is clear on this issue. And so my point is that, you know, I've been attacked from I think the governor and the attorney general and the lieutenant governor and Connor Lamb on this issue. But look, this isn't a Democrat or Republican issue to me. I'm actually looking out for Democrats as well, you know, because at some point there might be a Republican governor who puts forward a law that's unconstitutional that Democrats might not like. And so what I'm saying is I think it's very important that we adhere to the Constitution of our country, because it protects all of us. And so I'm not saying that we should be throwing out mail-in votes. I'm asking the court to help us find a remedy to make sure that everybody's voice is heard. And so people, you know, like people are talking about, like, the main critique from the left is Sean wants to throw out 2.5 million absentee votes. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that unconstitutional election laws disenfranchise everybody. And my question to my critics, John, would be, what about the millions, and I mean millions, of people in the state of Pennsylvania who didn't have a say as to whether or not they wanted mail-in balloting in the first place?
Well, of course, I guess they would argue they did have a say through their elected representatives and senators. But let me ask you this question, because after this case came down on, what was it, Saturday night, I think you tweeted, "It's not over." So what happens next?
Well, so this is a good question. I feel like I've got great attorneys. The Act 77 issue, the PA Supreme Court opined on it they dismissed my case, right? But and while we believe that the Act 77 is certainly a state issue, we do believe that there are very important federal questions nested within it. And so what we're doing is we're looking to appeal to the Supreme Court on those federal questions, and we're hoping that they take it up. They might not, right? It's hard to get a case in front of the Supreme Court, but I think we've got a good shot. And again, the goal here is to protect every citizen of our great Commonwealth, not both the people who showed up in person to vote and the people who voted by mail. We want to make sure that there's a structure and system in place that is constitutional and one that people can trust, John, because right now, I mean, that Pennsylvania as a whole was a razor thin margin, and 50% of the people in this state aren't trusting the outcome. And so what I'm trying to do is not be a partisan, not a Democrat or Republican, but lead on the issue of election reform moving forward so that everybody in our great Commonwealth can have faith in our system. That's the most important thing to me here.
Some people would say, well, this was pretty strictly a state question of whether or not Act 77 violates the state constitution. What exactly are the federal questions that you see in your lawsuit?
Well, I'm not going to answer that question on the air because I don't want to show my hand. But when my attorney files the appeal, I am sure that he will talk to you about it, John, because he's probably better suited to talk about the legalese around this stuff. But I personally think we've got a pretty good shot to get it in front of the Supreme Court.
Do you think you have 4 justices? It only takes 4 of the 9 to grant certiorari and to allow this appeal to go forward. Do you think you got 4 justices on the U.S. Supreme Court?
We'll see. I hope. Look, John, this is not an easy position for me to be in. I'm getting attacked by Republicans and Democrats, but I think it's important that moving forward that we have a system, an electoral system in place that people trust. John, this is about the people of our Commonwealth. And it's about the people of our Commonwealth having a say. And you said that they had a say through their legislators, and that's a fair point. But the constitutional amendment process was not done, and the PA Constitution is pretty clear on what they define as an absentee ballot. And so if you want to pass Act 77, let's do it the right procedural way, and let's give the people a voice.
Finally, Sean Parnell, I wouldn't be much of a journalist if I didn't ask you about the rumor mill out there, which is that Sean Parnell is going to run for the U.S. Senate in 2022.
Is that a rumor? That's not a rumor.
We've been hearing that out there, and it's been tweeted, and social media is a little bit of buzz that your name is out there. Is this something that you might consider?
John, I think you've known me for a long time. Politics, I loathe politics. I just do. I love the people, right? But so I feel like we haven't even closed out this election. I don't think we should speculate on the future at all. But again, like
well, you have a lot of fans out there. You do know that.
You know what, John? Thank you for saying that. I really do mean it when I say I love the people of Pennsylvania, Democrats and Republicans, the people who voted for me and the people who didn't, and, I am looking out for them with this lawsuit. As I mentioned earlier, like they might find themselves on the end of an unconstitutional law from a Republican governor they might not like. And so I'm trying to make sure that they're protected moving forward. So John, I will always serve this Commonwealth, whether I run for future political office or not. I'll always look out for the people. I took an oath to defend the Constitution. That oath doesn't expire. And so, running for future office is certainly news to me. If it's a rumor, I guess it's kind of cool that there are actually rumors out there on these issues. But I feel like let's wrap up this election first, and let's give people some faith in the process moving forward.
Well, that's fair enough. You're not closing any doors, but I certainly appreciate the chance to talk to Sean Parnell, congressional candidate, 17th Congressional District, and plaintiff in an important lawsuit that is not over yet. Thank you, sir, very much for being with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John.
Hi, I'm John Delano, political editor, KDKA-TV, CBS Pittsburgh. And our very special guest is Amy Wildermuth, professor and dean of the University of Pittsburgh Law School, and someone who I've come to count on regularly as very knowledgeable about the U.S. Supreme Court because you actually work there, you clerk there.
That is
Thank you
correct.
very much. Professor, always good to be with you. Thank you so much.
Great to be here.
So let me ask you about this lawsuit that the state Supreme Court ruled on, essentially dismissed over the weekend, involving Congressman Mike Kelly and Sean Parnell,
Yeah.
which had to do with their claim that no-fault mail-in voting in Pennsylvania violated the state constitution.
Yeah.
They now want to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Can they do that?
They certainly can. The question is whether the Supreme Court will want to hear the case. And of course, as we've talked about before, the Supreme Court usually has two steps. One, you have to ask for the Supreme Court to hear your case. They have to agree. We're going to need 4 justices to agree, and then they would hear the case. What's the likelihood of them hearing this case? I don't think this is one that will necessarily be of interest to them.
And why is that?
Well, I think this question is really wrapped up in a lot of state law. And the Supreme Court of the United States is really there to talk about federal law. So unless we have a significant, substantial federal law question, they typically take a pass on these kinds of cases.
What would be the federal angle? We're still waiting to see the appeal itself or the petition. I guess to be correct, it's a petition for certiorari. Is that the proper terminology here?
That is correct. So they filed this petition that essentially says, please, Supreme Court, hear our case. And they have to say, this is the federal law question that's involved. And right now, as far as we know, the question has really been around that state constitutional issue. And because that's a matter of state constitutional law, our state Supreme Court is the one that is the last to speak on that issue. So my best idea here in terms of what the federal issue might be is probably something under the 14th Amendment, the due process clause. Some sort of question that the right process wasn't followed, et cetera.
Yeah, can you explain that a little bit more? What is the due process argument here with respect to mail-in voting?
You know, I would have to stretch myself to really be able to come up with a good due process argument here. But they're going to have to say, right, in some way, by denying this state constitutional right, that they are then being denied what is due to them, their process that's due to them under the federal constitution. I think it's a complicated and difficult argument.
There is also, as you know, an appeal likely, I gather, in the decision of First Middle District U.S. District Court Judge Brand,
Right.
which was appealed to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in Philadelphia.
Correct.
And on both cases, this was the Trump campaign bringing this lawsuit, and they lost at both levels. And they're arguing generally an equal protection argument, but if I understand correctly, this case has to do with amending complaints. What can you tell us about the likelihood of that case going to the U.S. Supreme Court?
I think, again, what we'd have to ask ourselves is why would the Supreme Court want to take a case? They typically take cases when they present big and important questions in a case where it's very clear what the question being presented is. So we often call that a good vehicle for resolving the issue. In this particular case, the one that's coming out of the Third Circuit, it's very hard to say that we have a really great case that we can understand the issues on, because quite frankly, that's the problem with the case. It's very difficult to understand exactly what's going on. And again, the question is about something that's fairly routine at this point. Can you amend your complaint?
So you think it's not likely the U.S. Supreme Court will take up any of these cases out of Pennsylvania?
I don't think so. I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons to think that they aren't in the best possible posture to be taken by the Supreme Court. But I think there's another thing that's going on here. And that is where this is not going to make a difference in the outcome of the election, it is unlikely that the Supreme Court would weigh in. And why not? Even if it was a really interesting question, they want to stay out of this in terms of their own integrity. And so what you hear from a lot of commentators right now who watch the Supreme Court closely is that they just feel like it's very unlikely the Supreme Court would wade into this. It's been enough of an upset, shall we say. It does not need another character or actor in this drama.
And then finally, Professor, there is a stay, I believe, by Justice Alito on the counting of these ballots that the state Supreme Court said could be counted if postmarked by election day, but received until the Friday after the election.
Yeah.
Now, we have those ballots in many of the counties. I understand they've been counted. They will not affect the election, as I understand it, at least the presidential election. What's that stay all about, and does it disappear? Does Justice Alito remove it at some point, or what's going on here?
I mean, it is sort of a messy last little piece of the equation. And you would imagine that that stay indicated that there would be some kind of interest from the Supreme Court. But again, given that they're not going to have an impact on the outcome of the election, I imagine that it may just go by the wayside, right? It may just be something that we're not going to take up any further than what has already happened.
Well, does that mean Justice Alito dissolves his stay and those votes get counted as per the state Supreme Court's ruling?
I have not seen any action yet from the Supreme Court, and I'm not sure exactly what they would want to do to sort of resolve this in the end. But of course, because it does not impact the outcome of the election, it may be that we won't know the resolution to it until much later. But again, typically, this is the kind of thing that if the Supreme Court was really interested in it, they would get it on the docket and we would see it getting argued. Because it doesn't have that impact, I just don't see it happening.
Well, it may not have an impact in the presidential race, but we do have an election here that is with in the state Senate, where the incumbent is ahead by 89 votes. And my understanding is there could be a couple hundred votes that came in after the election that haven't been counted. Now, we actually know the results of those. They were counted. They're just not added in. And
Correct.
They will not affect the outcome from what I'm told. They'll affect the final numbers. But, there's always consequences of these things. So,
right. And again, I think that the real question is it going to impact the election? So for this election, I can't see it making any difference. If it was going to make a difference, you better bet that the lawyers would be at the Supreme Court and they would be arguing right now. But without that, I just don't see there being much traction to this. The real question is going to be going forward into the next set of elections. What is it that we can expect? I would imagine that we might see more of these lawsuits filed before the next election cycle so that we can get some resolution on some of these more interesting questions.
Well, that's a very interesting point, Professor, and we'll maybe make this the last question then. So you're anticipating that there are enough justices who would like to get into electoral politics, these questions of law, that they're willing to take it up before the election is actually held, rather than wait till after where there's an outcome.
Yeah, I think that there could be some interest at the Supreme Court, certainly true. But I think the more interesting thing will be to watch how the state courts will respond, as well as some of these challenges that might be brought in the federal district court. For example, the case we started talking about, right? That could be this question about the state constitution and whether we can have no excuse mail-in ballots. It could be a good question to bring in the next election cycle. So it could be something that we could see back before the state's courts sometime soon.
Well, Professor Amy Wildermuth, thank you so much for spending time with me today. You're a wealth of information. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
This has been a CBSN Pittsburgh special presentation. We now return to our scheduled programming in progress.
Looks like it's going to be a very messy rest of tonight and tomorrow, and much colder. So as we take a look at the radar, you can see that we still have mainly liquid precipitation